In a village shrouded by pearlescent fog, Hassan discovers a haunting melody on an antique radio that originates from 50 years in the future. Alongside a small circle of companions in a dusty observatory, he explores a signal that responds to emotion and emits impossible colors. As the boundaries of time grow thin, Hassan must navigate the fragile connection to a ghostly future city. Listen on to discover if this celestial harmony can be sustained before the silence returns. The amber glow? Hassan al-Mansouri rotated his teacup in slow, rhythmic circles, the porcelain clicking faintly against the saucer. Outside the observatory windows, the pearlescent fog of the village didn't just drift, it pressed, a heavy white curtain that erased the horizon and swallowed the pine trees. He watched a single droplet of condensation trail down the glass, carving a jagged path through the grime. The tea, a dark oolong, sent a thin ribbon of steam curling upward into the dim light of the room, where the scent of old paper and static crackle lingered like a permanent resident. He moved toward the workbench, his footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug that had lost its color decades ago. There sat the radio. It was a behemoth of polished mahogany and brass, its vacuum tubes arranged like a miniature city of glass. Hassan reached out, his fingers grazing the cool metal of the power switch. He flipped it. There was a momentary silence, then the low-frequency hum began, a deep, guttural vibration that he felt in the soles of his feet before he heard it with his ears. The tubes began to glow, shifting from a dull orange to a vibrant, searing amber that cast long, flickering shadows across the mahogany walls. As the machine warmed, Hassan felt the familiar pull of the ritual. He didn't just turn the radio on, he courted it. He waited for the heat to stabilize, for the smell of warming dust and electricity to fill the air. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the void between stations, the white noise that sounded like a distant ocean. He began to rotate the heavy tuning dial, the brass knob resisting slightly, clicking in increments that felt like the ticking of a clock. Outside, the fog shifted. It didn't just thicken, it solidified, sealing the observatory in a vacuum of white. The distant sound of a village dog barking or the far-off chime of the clock tower vanished. The world had been muted, reduced to the four walls of the room and the amber glow of the tubes. Hassan paused, his hand hovering over the dial. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pushed against the window panes, making the room feel like a diving bell submerged in a sea of milk. Then the static broke. It wasn't a sudden snap, but a slow bleed of sound. A melody emerged, cutting through the white noise with a clarity that felt invasive. Hassan froze. He knew the architecture of music. He had spent years teaching the rigid structures of Bach and the predictable resolutions of the Romantics. But this was different. The melody utilized intervals that shouldn't have worked, harmonies that defied the traditional laws of tension and release. It was a haunting, fluid composition, shifting seamlessly between the organic warmth of a cello and a synthetic, shimmering texture that sounded like light passing through a prism. He leaned in, his breath hitching. He tried to categorize it. Was it an avant-garde recording from a city he'd never visited? A lost piece of electronic experimentalism? But as he focused, trying to dismantle the chord progressions in his head, the signal began to waver. The music retreated into a hiss of static, the melody fraying at the edges like an old piece of lace. Hassan stepped back, his shoulders slumping. He let go of the intellectual pursuit. He stopped trying to solve the music as if it were a math problem, and instead let himself sink into the feeling of it. He thought of the city he had left behind, the noise and the frantic pace that had worn him thin, and the profound, aching loneliness of this hilltop. He allowed the melancholic yearning to wash over him, a familiar tide of longing for something he couldn't name. As he drifted, the signals surged. The music returned, louder and richer than before, as if the radio were feeding on his mood. The sound expanded, filling every corner of the observatory. It was no longer just a melody. It was a landscape. He could hear the echo of vast, open spaces and the whisper of voices that sounded like they were singing in a language that hadn't been invented yet. The warmth of the sound became physical, a sudden bloom of heat that felt like a sunbeam hitting his skin in the dead of winter. He closed his eyes, his head tilting further to the side, his entire body vibrating in sympathy with the frequency. In a moment of sudden clarity, he noticed a flickering light on the small digital auxiliary display, a modern addition he'd soldered onto the antique frame for stability. A string of numbers was scrolling across the green phosphor screen embedded in the signal's metadata. He squinted, leaning close enough that the heat from the vacuum tubes brushed his forehead. October 14, 2074. He recoiled, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He stared at the date, then at the radio, then back at the date. 50 years. The music wasn't a recording, it was a broadcast from a future that didn't exist yet. The impossibility of it should have sparked terror or denial, but instead, it felt like a missing piece of himself had finally clicked into place. He felt a surge of desperation, a need to hold on to this thread before it snapped. He reached for the dial, his fingers trembling. He wanted to lock the frequency, to carve this sliver of the future into his present. He moved with a precision he usually lacked, his eyes locked on the amber glow of the tubes. Just as his fingertips brushed the brass knob, the signal vanished. Not a fade, not a drift, a clean, surgical cut. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, leaving a void where the warmth had been. Hassan remained frozen, his hand still extended toward the dead dial. He stared at the green screen, but the numbers had vanished, replaced by a flat, unresponsive line. The amber glow of the tubes seemed dimmer now, the room suddenly colder. He felt a hollow sensation in his chest, the sudden withdrawal of a connection he hadn't known he needed. Then a sound broke the silence. It was a knock, not a tentative tap, but a sharp, authoritative sequence of 3 raps that echoed through the heavy oak door, vibrating through the floorboards. Hassan jumped, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected anyone at this hour, and certainly not someone who knocked with such rigid precision. The fog outside was still thick, an impenetrable wall. No one should have been able to find the observatory in this weather without a map and a lantern. Hassan wiped his palms on his trousers and walked toward the door, his movements slow and measured. He hesitated with his hand on the iron latch, the silence of the room weighing heavily on him. He pulled the door open. Standing there, framed by the oppressive white of the fog, was a woman in a crisp, charcoal-gray coat. She held a leather-bound ledger pressed against her chest, and her glasses were perched precariously on the bridge of her nose. She didn't look at Hassan first. Instead, her eyes scanned the interior of the room, landing on the glowing radio with a look of clinical disapproval. She adjusted her glasses with a quick, sharp movement of her finger. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," Isolde Moretti said, her voice staccato and devoid of warmth. "I have noticed a significant discrepancy in the atmospheric resonance logs for this sector, and I suspect your equipment is the cause." The Ledger of Logic. Isolde Moretti did not wait for an invitation. She stepped across the threshold with a precision that suggested she was measuring the floorboards for a future renovation, her charcoal-gray coat still damp with a fine sheen of mist. In her right hand, a silver fountain pen tapped a rapid, impatient beat against her chin, a rhythmic tick that sounded like a telegraph machine transmitting a warning. She didn't look at Hassan as she moved. Instead, her gaze swept the room in a wide, clinical arc, cataloging the dust motes dancing in the amber light and the stacks of yellowed sheet music leaning precariously against the walls. "This space is a cluttered relic of inefficiency," Isolde said, her voice crisp and devoid of any melodic quality. She paused by a mahogany side table, her pen hovering over the open pages of her leather-bound ledger. "The filing system is non-existent, the ventilation is inadequate, and the overall organization suggests a profound disregard for municipal standards. I cannot fathom how you manage to function in an environment that lacks a primary index." Hassan stepped back, his shoulder brushing against the cold metal of the radio's chassis. He felt the sudden urge to rotate a teacup, a ghost of a habit, though there was no tea in sight. He watched her move through the room, her presence like a surgical instrument cutting through the dreamlike haze of the observatory. She didn't just walk, she audited. Every step was a calculation, every glance a deduction. To Isolde, the room wasn't a sanctuary of sound, it was a series of errors waiting to be corrected. She came to a halt before the radio. The device sat on its heavy oak plinth, the vacuum tubes still humming with a residual warmth that seemed to push back against the chill of the fog. Isolde leaned in, her glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. She didn't touch the instrument, she approached it as one might approach a dormant explosive. She squinted at the wiring, her lips thinning into a line of professional distaste. "This is an absurdity," she stated with formal clarity. "These vacuum tubes are obsolete by at least 3 decades, and the wiring is technically non-functional. There is a severed connection at the primary capacitor, and the grounding wire is frayed beyond utility. By every law of electrical engineering, Mr. Al-Mansouri, this machine is a corpse. It is incapable of producing a signal, let alone a broadcast." Hassan felt a tightening in his throat, a physical resistance to her logic. He thought of the music, the shimmering, impossible chords that had filled the room moments ago, sounds that felt like they were being played on instruments not yet invented. "It isn't about the wiring," he said, his voice low and measured, weighing each syllable. "There is a resonance, a melody that doesn't follow the standard laws of frequency. It comes through the fog, as if the air itself is acting as a conductor for something further away." Isolde stopped the tapping of her pen. She turned to him, her expression one of genuine, albeit clinical, pity. "What you are describing is auditory pareidolia. It is a well-documented phenomenon where the human mind perceives familiar patterns, usually music or voices, within random noise. The atmospheric pressure of the fog, combined with the acoustic properties of this hilltop, creates a sensory vacuum. Your mind is simply filling the silence with a melody of your own construction to stave off the isolation of this post." She stepped away from the radio and flipped through her ledger with a sharp snapping sound of parchment. "Furthermore, my records indicate a discrepancy in your very presence here. According to the Municipal Registry of 1954, this observatory was officially decommissioned and stripped of its funding. It ceased to be a functional entity of the state 70 years ago. Consequently, your tenure as the resident teacher and caretaker is entirely unofficial. You are, for all intents and purposes, a squatter in a government ruin." The revelation hit Hassan not as a shock, but as a cold weight. He looked around the room, the peeling wallpaper, the smell of old static crackle and damp wool, the radio that felt more like a living thing than a piece of furniture. He had treated this place as a sanctuary, a quiet corner of the world where he could drift. To hear it described as a government ruin felt like a violation of a private confidence. A surge of protectiveness flared in his chest, a sudden sharp heat that made him move before he had consciously decided to. He stepped forward, placing his body between Isolde and the radio, his arm extending to shield the glowing tubes from her scrutiny. He didn't shout, that wasn't his way, but his stance was rigid, his eyes locked on hers. He felt the sudden desperate need to guard the secret of the future music, to keep it safe from a woman who viewed the world as a ledger to be balanced. Isolde froze. She didn't recoil, but her pen stopped midair. Her eyes shifted from Hassan's face to the gap between his arm and the radio. The room had fallen into a heavy, expectant silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Then a flicker of light caught her periphery. Deep within the glass envelopes of the vacuum tubes, a glow began to stir. It wasn't the warm amber light of a heating element, nor the dull orange of a standard filament. It was a deep iridescent violet, a color so saturated and strange that it seemed to vibrate against the air. It was a hue that didn't belong in the visible spectrum of the current era, a color that felt like a memory of a place that hadn't been built yet. It pulsed slowly, like a steady, sleeping heart. Isolde's professional detachment wavered. For the first time, her staccato rhythm broke. She leaned in, her glasses slipping further, her eyes widening as she tried to categorize the light. She reached into her coat for a handheld spectrometer, her movements suddenly frantic, her need for empirical evidence overriding her disdain for the room's inefficiency. She wanted to measure it, to pin the color to a coordinate on a chart, to prove that it was a chemical fluke or a trick of the light. As she extended the device toward the tubes, the radio reacted. The violet light spiked, turning into a blinding neon flash that illuminated the dust on the ceiling. Simultaneously, the machine emitted a sound. Not a melody, and not a broadcast, but a sudden, piercing, high-pitched shriek. It was a sonic needle, a frequency so sharp it felt like it was slicing through the very fabric of the room. On the side table, a delicate porcelain tea saucer, a remnant of some previous tenant's morning, shuddered violently. With a sharp, crystalline crack, it shattered into 100 jagged shards, the pieces spraying across the hardwood floor like shrapnel. The shriek cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a ringing vacuum in its wake. Isolde jumped back, her spectrometer clattering to the floor. She stared at the broken porcelain, then at the now silent radio, her face pale. Her composure had been fractured along with the saucer, leaving her looking small and unexpectedly fragile in her gray coat. Hassan didn't move. He watched the shards of the saucer and then at the violet glow, which had faded back into a soft rhythmic pulse. He felt a strange sense of kinship with the machine. It had defended itself. He studied Isolde, whose hand was trembling slightly as she reached for her glasses. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice finally losing its staccato edge. "The heart's frequency." Hassan didn't answer her. Instead, he knelt on the hardwood, his fingers brushing the jagged white fragments of the saucer. The porcelain felt cold, dead, and utterly mundane compared to the humming heat of the radio. He looked up at the vacuum tubes, where the iridescent violet light had subsided into a slow, rhythmic throb, like a creature catching its breath after a fright. Isolde remained frozen, her hands still hovering in the air where the spectrometer had been, her eyes fixed on the machine with a mixture of horror and a hunger she couldn't quite name. "Leave the shards," Hassan said, his voice low and measured. "They are just clay. The machine is something else." He turned away from her, moving toward the heavy oak desk in the corner of the observatory. Spread across the surface were the notebooks of Mei-Ling Zhao, the previous caretaker. There were leather-bound journals with frayed edges, their pages filled with a script that didn't so much write as float. Mei-Ling's handwriting was sweeping and airy, looping around the margins in cursive that looked like wind-blown silk. Hassan began to flip through the pages, the paper rasping against his fingertips. He ignored the technical diagrams of capacitors and grounding wires, searching instead for the gaps in the logic, the places where the science stopped and something more fluid began. He found it in a journal bound in faded indigo cloth. The ink here was thinner, the loops tighter. "The dial is a lie," the entry began. "One does not tune the frequency of the air, but the frequency of the ghost. Temporal resonance is not a matter of hertz or ohms, but of vibration. The machine does not seek a coordinate in time, it seeks a coordinate in the heart. To hear the future, one must first provide the bridge, a memory of such purity or such pain that it transcends the present." Hassan stared at the words. He felt a sudden sharp pull in his chest. He watched the radio, then back at the notes. "The signal feeds on the echo," Mei-Ling had written. "It is a mirror. If you offer it silence, it returns a void. If you offer it a longing, it returns a song." He stepped back toward the device, his movements slow. He didn't touch the dial this time. Instead, he closed his eyes and let himself drift. He reached back into the gray cupboards of his mind, searching for the weight of his own solitude. He thought of the city he had fled, the suffocating noise, the crowds of strangers who brushed past him like ghosts, and the hollow ache of the evening he realized he had no one to call. He leaned into that loneliness, letting the coldness of it settle in his marrow, visualizing the empty apartment and the silence that had felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. The radio reacted instantly. There was no shriek this time, only a soft, melodic chime that resonated in the floorboards. The violet light flared, steady and warm, and suddenly the room was filled with a broadcast of crystalline clarity. It was a symphony of sounds he couldn't name, instruments that sounded like glass being bowed by the wind, harmonies that shifted in dimensions he couldn't perceive. It was beautiful, but as the music swelled, Hassan noticed something strange. He looked down at his hands. The tan of his skin seemed to paler. He studied the deep mahogany of the desk. The rich brown was leaching away, turning a dusty, washed-out gray. The colors of the room were bleaching, as if the radio were drinking the pigment of the present to fuel the broadcast of the future. "This is absurd," a voice snapped. Isolde had recovered her composure, though she remained several feet away from the radio. She had retrieved her spectrometer, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "You are suggesting that a piece of mid-century electronics is operated by, what? Sentiment? Emotion? That is not how physics functions, Mr. Al-Mansouri. It is a chemical reaction, or perhaps a localized atmospheric anomaly. It is certainly not a heart frequencies." She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the wood, her expression one of clinical disdain. "Logic dictates that if there is a signal, there is a transmitter. If there is a light, there is a power source. Your emotional theory is a fairy tale for people who cannot bear the silence of a ledger." As she spoke, the music shifted. A sudden, soaring chord ripped through the air, a sequence of notes that felt less like sound and more like a physical touch. It was a chord of profound, aching tenderness. Isolde stopped mid-sentence. Her jaw didn't just drop, it slackened. Her rigid posture, the one that made her look like a pressed flower in a book, suddenly collapsed. She swayed on her feet, her hands slipping from her glasses, which slid down the bridge of her nose. Her eyes glazed over, the pupils dilating until the iris was nearly gone. For a moment, the observatory vanished. Isolde wasn't standing in a fog-veiled room with a strange man. She was 4 years old, smelling the scent of powdered sugar and old wool. She heard a voice, her mother's voice, humming a lullaby that had been erased from her conscious memory 20 years ago. It was a low, vibrating hum, a sound of absolute safety and unconditional love. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow, a visceral surge of grief and warmth that left her breathless. A single tear escaped and tracked a slow path through the dust on her cheek. "How?" she whispered, her voice no longer staccato but fragile and thin. I don't remember that. I don't remember her sounding like that." Hassan didn't answer. He felt the signal wavering, the colors of the room continuing to fade into a ghostly monochrome. He knew he couldn't hold the tension through sheer will. He had to stop fighting the pull. He sank into a meditative surrender, letting his shoulders drop, releasing the grip he had on his own identity. He stopped trying to operate the machine and instead became a part of its circuit. He allowed the music to wash over him, not as a listener, but as a vessel. He ceased to be the schoolteacher in the fog. He became the vibration itself. As he surrendered, the music shifted again. The crystalline instruments faded into the background and a new sound emerged. It was a voice. It was distorted, layered with a metal-sharp shimmer, as if the speaker were talking through a veil of water. It wasn't singing, it was speaking, the words fragmented and drifting. "The spires," the voice whispered, the tone ethereal and distant. "The singing glass of the lower city, the gardens that bloom in the dark." Hassan held his breath. The voice sounded ancient and futuristic all at once, a ghost from a world that hadn't happened yet. He felt a thrill of terror and wonder. He wanted to reach into the vacuum tubes and pull the speaker into the room. He wanted to ask about the floating spires and the glass that sang. Then the voice sharpened. The distortion cleared for a split second, the frequency locking in with a sudden, violent precision. "Hassan," the voice said. It didn't just say his name. It spoke it with an intimacy that suggested it had known him for a lifetime. It was a call from a distance of 50 years, a recognition across a void that should have been impassable. Before he could gasp, before Isolde could react, the radio erupted. A surge of static, loud as a crashing wave, slammed into the room. The violet light spiked into a blinding white flash, and then, with a sound like a snapping cable, the signal cut off. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the fog outside, leaving Hassan staring at the dead dials of a machine that had just called him by name. The synchronicity flicker. The mahogany doors surrendered to the force of Rohan's entry. He burst into the observatory, sending a stack of Mailing's old journals sliding across the floor, their vellum pages fluttering like dying birds. Rohan didn't apologize. His fingers were already drumming a frantic jazz beat against the heavy table, a sharp contrast to the ringing silence that had lingered since the radio's collapse. "Did you hear it? The spike? The velocity of that last transmission?" Rohan's voice boomed, bouncing off the curved walls. He bounced on his heels, pupils dilated, looking like a man who had survived a lightning strike and liked the taste of static. He clutched his saxophone case to his chest like a holy relic. It wasn't just a broadcast, Hassan. It was a prompt. A challenge. That frequency was asking for a response. Hassan stood by the radio, hand hovering near the dead dials. He felt hollow, as if the voice from the future had reached into his chest and pulled out something vital. He slowly rotated his teacup. The liquid had gone cold, a thin film of oil shimmering on the surface. "It called my name, Rohan," Hassan said, his voice low, each word a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. "It didn't ask for a duet. It recognized me." "Exactly." Rohan snapped open the case with a metal-sharp click. He assembled the instrument with violent speed. Recognition is a conversation. If the future knows you, it knows the music you're capable of. We can't let the signal go cold. We have to jam with it, push back against the void with something loud enough to bridge the gap. Hassan tilted his head, listening to the humming silence of the vacuum tubes. They still smelled of hot dust and singed electricity. He remembered the way the violet light had felt. Not like light, but like physical pressure against his skin. "The machine is fragile," Hassan cautioned. "It doesn't respond to force. It responds to resonance." "Resonance is just force with a better education," Rohan countered. He stepped toward the radio, his boots clunking on the floorboards, and blew a piercing high C. It was a bright, brassy needle that seemed to prick the air. Hassan instinctively reached for the dials. He began to tune the radio, not searching for a station, but trying to find the emotional frequency Rohan was projecting. He leaned into the musician's hunger, the raw need to be heard. As he turned the knob, the vacuum tubes breathed. A soft amber light pulsed in time with Rohan's breathing. Then, it happened. A shimmering melody leaked from the speakers, crystalline chords like falling glass. Rohan didn't miss a beat. He slid into the melody, his saxophone weaving around the future's music with improvisational grace. It was a conversation across 50 years. The radio provided a haunting foundation. Rohan built a cathedral of sound upon it. For several minutes, the boundary between present and future blurred into a haze of amber light. Hassan watched the dust motes turn into glowing embers drifting in impossible patterns. He felt a sensation of expansion, as if his body were becoming a chord in a larger symphony. The music was a physical presence, a golden syrup that slowed the heart. It was a temporal synchronicity, a moment where linear time folded in on itself. But Rohan was no longer conversing. He was conquering. Swept up in the energy, he pushed the improvisation into a chaotic crescendo. He played faster and louder, his notes becoming jagged, demanding more from the machine. He wanted to tear the future open with the sheer volume of his ambition. "Rohan, stop," Hassan whispered, but he was drowned out by a soaring, distorted wail. The radio reacted violently. The amber light snapped into a blinding, unstable white. The vacuum tube screamed, a high-pitched shriek like 1,000 needles scraping a mirror. The iridescent violet returned, fractured and flickering. The air grew heavy with static. The hair on Hassan's arms stood up, and the scent of chemical static crackle became overwhelming. Hassan saw the glass of the tubes vibrate, the filaments dancing with erratic energy. He realized then that the beauty of the music lay in surrender. Rohan was trying to solve the radio like a puzzle, forcing a door that only opened when one stopped pushing. With a decisive movement, Hassan lunged forward and killed the power. The silence that followed was a physical blow. It left Rohan breathless and shaking, his saxophone still pressed to his lips, a final note hanging unfinished in the air. The blinding light vanished, leaving a dim, gray twilight. The room felt suddenly cold and cavernous, smelling of scorched electronics. Rohan lowered his instrument, his chest heaving. "I almost had it," he murmured, his bravado gone. "I could feel the other side. It was right there." "It wasn't there for the taking," Hassan said. He studied the dead machine, then the scattered journals of Mei Ling Zhao. A line from her notes surfaced in his mind. "The music is a gift of patience, not a puzzle to be solved." He understood it now. The radio wasn't a telephone, it was a mirror. When Rohan tried to dominate the signal reflected that aggression back as instability. The longing was the bridge, and the attempt to cross it too quickly only burned it down. As the radio cooled, the vacuum tubes emitting small, rhythmic clicks, a sound emerged. It wasn't a broadcast or a signal. It was a single, clear note, a solitary, pure tone that resonated in the center of the room. Then, the note evolved into a melody. It was a simple, fragile lullaby, stripped of all futuristic shimmer. Hassan froze, a sharp pressure tightening his throat. It was a melody he had written for his mother when he was a small child, a sequence of notes he had hummed into her ear during a long-ago fever. A song he had never written down, never performed, and had long since forgotten. The radio wasn't playing a broadcast from the future. It was playing a memory from his own heart, returned to him from a place where time no longer mattered. He stood in the silence of the observatory, listening to the ghost of his own childhood, while beside him Rohan watched the dials with a look of profound, humbled confusion. The translucent world. Hassan reached for the porcelain cup, but his fingers didn't meet the resistance of the glaze. Instead, his hand slid through the rim, as if the tea and the saucer were made of moonlight and smoke. He froze, his wrist hovering in the air, watching with a detached sort of horror as the skin of his hand turned a pale, iridescent violet. He could see the grain of the wooden table through his own palm, the dark whorls of the oak appearing as if through a sheet of frosted glass. He tried to curl his fingers into a fist, but the movement felt sluggish, like he was pushing through deep water, and the edges of his silhouette were beginning to fray, blurring into the gray air of the observatory. Around him, the world had ceased to be solid. The heavy stone walls of the observatory, which had always felt like a fortress against the fog, were now little more than veils of thin, translucent gauze. Through the shimmering fabric of the room, a different geography began to bleed through. Hassan saw the soaring, impossible geometries of a city that defied gravity, spires of polished obsidian and floating gardens of neon flora that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. It was the city the voice from the radio had described, a place of silver rains and humming silence, and it was pressing against the present moment, overlapping with the dust and the scent of old vacuum tubes. He felt a sudden, terrifying lightness in his chest. The gravity of the village, the weight of his own loneliness, and the dull ache of his daily routines were evaporating. He felt an impulse, sharp and magnetic, to simply lean forward and step through the wall. The muted colors of his life, the browns, the grays, the faded creams, seemed offensively drab compared to the shimmering violet horizon of that other place. Why stay here, he wondered, in a world where he was merely a ghost of himself, when he could become a citizen of that luminescence? Isolde stood a few feet away, her ledger open and her pen poised. For the first time since she had arrived at the observatory, she wasn't writing. Her pen remained suspended, a single drop of ink trembling on the nib, threatening to fall and ruin the pristine white of the page. She wasn't looking at the radio, nor was she measuring the atmospheric pressure or recording the frequency of the iridescent light. She was looking at Hassan's translucent hand, her eyes wide behind her glasses, her mouth slightly open. The rigid clinical mask she wore had finally cracked, leaving behind a raw, human bewilderment. "It is impossible," Isolde whispered. Her voice lacked its usual staccato precision. It was a fragile sound, strict of authority. She didn't move to help him, nor did she move away. She simply watched the man in front of her dissolve, her ledger. The book she believed could contain the entire world, now a useless slab of paper in the face of a phenomenon that refused to be indexed. "I am becoming a frequency," Hassan thought, and the thought felt like a slide into a deep, dark well. If I slip just a little further, if I let go of the memory of the floor beneath my feet, I will simply cease to be a man and become a sound. I will be a note in a song that hasn't been written yet. Is this what longing does? Does it eventually erode the bone and the blood until there is nothing left but the wish itself? I can see the silver rain. I can almost smell the static crackle of that city. It is so much easier to be a ghost than to be a teacher in a village that forgets you are there. HD. The detachment was nearly absolute. He felt his consciousness expanding, stretching thin across the gap of 50 years, pulling him toward the shimmering spires. He was no longer Hassan al-Mansouri. He was a vibration, a hum, a sliver of light caught in a draft. The room began to fade entirely, the image of Isolde becoming a distant, blurry smudge of gray against the encroaching violet. Then, the heavy oak door creaked open, and the atmosphere of the room shifted violently. The smell hit him first. Not the static crackle of the future or the dust of the past, but the pungent, earthy scent of damp wool and the warm, buttery aroma of fresh pastries. Ji Woo stepped into the room, her apron dusted with flour, carrying a tray with the steady grace that suggested knew exactly where she stood in the world. She didn't gasp or recoil at the sight of the shimmering walls or Hassan's ghostly transparency. She simply walked forward, her footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the floorboards, a sound that felt like a hammer striking an anvil in the silence of the resonance. "You've drifted too far again, Hassan," Ji Woo said. Her voice was a warm blanket, grounding and familiar. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like a mother catching a child wandering too close to a riverbank. She reached the table and, without a word, placed a steaming ceramic cup directly in front of him. The tea wasn't the usual amber brew. This liquid was a deep, swirling indigo, emitting a steam that smelled sharp and contradictory. As Hassan leaned in, he recognized the scent instantly. It was the smell of static crackle, crushed mint, and a metal sharp sweetness, the exact sensory profile the voice from the future had described in the broadcast. It was as if Ji Woo had brewed a cup of the future itself to drag him back to the present. The scent acted like a physical hook. The moment the aroma hit his nostrils, the violet shimmer of the city flickered and dimmed. The sensory shock was a jolt of electricity that snapped his consciousness back into the confines of his skin. He gasped, a sudden, heavy inhalation of air that felt like plunging into ice water. He looked down and saw his hand solidify, the iridescent glow receding from his fingertips, and the porcelain of the cup, once again becoming a hard, cold reality. He felt the sudden crushing weight of his own body, the ache in his lower back, the tightness in his throat, the sheer, wonderful heaviness of being made of matter. He slumped back into his chair, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The walls of the observatory solidified around them, the gauze vanishing, and the stone returning to its stubborn, opaque gray. The futuristic city vanished as if a curtain had been drawn, leaving the room feeling small and dim once more. Isolde finally blinked, her pen dropping, and leaving a thick black blot of ink on her ledger, a permanent stain on her perfect record. Hassan looked up at Jiwoo. She was still standing there, her hands resting on the edge of the table, watching him with an expression that was both tender and profoundly sorrowful. There was a knowing look in her eyes, a depth of understanding that suggested this wasn't the first time she had witnessed a man begin to dissolve into a melody. She didn't ask how it happened or why the radio was doing this. She simply watched him with the gaze of a person who had spent years acting as an anchor for a man who was always trying to float away. "Drink the tea, Hassan," she said softly, "before you forget how to taste it." Hassan wrapped his solid fingers around the warm cup, feeling the heat seep into his palms. He studied the radio, its vacuum tubes now glowing with a steady, quiet amber. Beside him, Isolde was staring at the ink blot on her page, her face pale. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was heavy with the realization that the boundary between the now and the then was not a wall, but a thin, permeable membrane, and they were all standing on the edge of a tier. The final fade. The wind didn't just shift, it tore. It ripped through the eaves of the observatory with a sudden, violent clarity that stripped the pearlescent fog from the moor in a single, shivering heave. Hassan stood by the window, his forehead pressed against the glass, watching the world sharpen. For months the fog had been a velvet curtain, a sanctuary of blur and soft edges that mirrored the static of the radio. Now, the moor laid itself bare, brown, jagged, and indifferent. The sharp, cold reality of the landscape felt like an intrusion, a sudden brightness that made the interior of the room seem dim and claustrophobic. He turned back to the radio, his fingers hovering over the brass dials. The vacuum tubes were still glowing, but the light had lost its iridescent punch. The amber was pale, flickering like a candle in a draught. He tuned the dial with a slow, rhythmic precision, searching for that shimmering thread of future music, but all he found was a thin, whistling wind and a hollow hiss. The melody was there, barely, a ghost of a symphony, a distant echo that sounded as if it were being played at the bottom of a deep well. He leaned in, closing his eyes, trying to summon the loneliness that usually acted as a bridge, but the void felt different now. It wasn't a yearning, it was a closing door. "It is receding," Isolde said. She was standing by the heavy oak table, her ledger open. She didn't look up, but her pen was tapping against her chin in a rapid, impatient beat. "The atmospheric pressure has dropped 12 millibars in the last hour." The fog was a conductor, Hassan. Without the moisture and the ionic charge of the mist, the signal is losing its medium. It is a simple matter of physics. Hassan didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, listening to the gaps between the static. "It doesn't feel like physics," he said, his voice low and measured. "It feels like a goodbye." Isolde stopped tapping. She studied him, her glasses reflecting the dying amber of the tubes. Goodbyes are emotional constructs. Signals simply attenuate. They fade until the signal-to-noise ratio becomes untenable. That is the empirical reality. "Perhaps," Hassan murmured, "but the reality is that the music is leaving us." From the corner of the room, Rohan let out a sharp, frustrated breath. He had been pacing the perimeter of the rug, his saxophone clutched in his hand like a weapon. He stopped abruptly and brought the mouthpiece to his lips. He blew a sudden, searing high note, trying to catch the frequency of the fading broadcast, attempting to weave his own breath into the disappearing tapestry of the future. He played a frantic, improvisational run, a flurry of jazz notes that sought to provoke the radio, to demand it stay. But the saxophone sounded hollow. Against the ethereal, distant hum of the transmission, Rohan's instrument sounded jarringly ordinary, a piece of brass and reed fighting against a tide of silence. The music didn't blend, it collided. The broadcast didn't respond to the challenge. It simply continued its slow, steady retreat into the noise. Rohan pulled the instrument away, his chest heaving. He watched the radio with a mixture of reverence and betrayal. "I can't find the pocket," he whispered, his voice resonant but cracked. "I can't find the space where the two sounds meet. It's like the doors locking from the other side." Jiwoo entered the room then, carrying a tray with a fresh pot of the indigo tea. The scent of crushed mint and metal-sharp sweetness filled the air, but the aroma didn't have the same visceral pull it once did. It was just tea now, warm, comforting, but terrestrial. She set the tray down with a gentle click and watched the three of them. She didn't mention the signal, nor the weather. She simply began to pour, the liquid, a deep, shimmering purple in the porcelain cups. Hassan took his cup, wrapping his fingers around the warmth. He didn't drink immediately. Instead, he began to rotate the cup in slow, circular motions on the saucer, the ceramic scraping softly. Usually, this motion was a symptom of his drift, a sign that his mind was wandering toward the iridescent city and the voices that called his name. But today, the rotation felt different. It felt like a clock winding down. He felt a strange, sleepy peace settling over him, a realization that the impossible was not meant to be a permanent residence, but a visitation. "I can't stay here," Rohan said suddenly. He wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at his instrument case, already half packed by the door. "If I stay in this village, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to transcribe a song I can't remember. I'll be chasing a ghost." "You have the spark now, though," Hassan said softly. "The longing is what makes the music move." Rohan managed a wry, thin smile. He shouldered his case, the weight of it shifting his posture. "The future music ruined my taste for everything else, Hassan. Everything sounds like a rehearsal now. But I think I'd rather spend the rest of my life longing for that sound than pretending I never heard it. It's a better kind of hunger." He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor until the heavy front door groaned shut, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in his wake. Isolde remained by the table. She looked down at her ledger, the pages filled with meticulous notes on frequencies, timestamps, and the chemical composition of the fog. She reached the final page. It was a stark, clean expanse of cream-colored paper. She hovered her pen over the surface, the ink trembling. For a moment, she looked as if she might try to categorize the silence, to define the exact moment of the fade in a series of neat columns. Then, with a definitive sharp snap, she closed the ledger. She didn't write a single word. She left the final page blank, a deliberate void, a concession to the unknowable that no ledger could ever contain. "I suppose," she said, her voice losing some of its staccato edge, "that some data points are simply irrelevant to the final sum." As the twilight deepened into a bruised purple, the radio gave a sudden, violent shudder. The vacuum tubes flared one last time, not with the erratic violet of a storm, but with a steady, crystal-clear white light. The static vanished instantly. The room became vacuum-still. Then came the sound. It wasn't a melody or a song. It was a collective whisper, 1,000 voices layered upon one another, overlapping in a warm harmonic wave that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. The words were soft, clear, and profoundly intimate. "Thank you." The transmission didn't fade this time. It ended. The white light vanished, and the vacuum tubes dimmed, the amber glow receding until they went cold and dark. The radio became what it had always been in the eyes of the world, a heavy box of wood and wire, a silent relic of a forgotten era. Hassan sat in the gathering gloom, the tea in his cup now cold. He felt the weight of the present moment pressing in on him, the smell of old paper, the chill of the draft, the sound of Jiwoo's soft breathing beside him. He studied her, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to float away. The iridescent city was a beautiful song, a haunting promise of what might be, but as he reached out and took Jiwoo's hand in his, he felt the rough texture of her skin and the warmth of her pulse. It was a heavy, grounding reality, and it was enough.